Political and social events taking place leading up to and during the American Revolution, including boycotts, the actions of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, committees of correspondence, and the Continental Congresses, were influenced by Enlightenment ideals of the social contract and separation of powers. These ideals included the thinking that if a government is not offering protections to its citizens, then the recourse is overthrow of that government, that the concept of monarchy didn't fit in with the Enlightenment, and there should be separation of powers. Revolutionary ideals were also influenced by American exceptionalism, that Americans were a people blessed with liberty, rewarded by God for their religious beliefs. The colonists' belief in the superiority of republican government found expression in Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence, and these ideals continue to resonate through American history. For example, the Constitution's basis in popular sovereignty, the system of checks and balances, the modification of the Declaration of Independence's language at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention to state that all men and women were created equal, or Abraham Lincoln's emphasis that government was of the people, by the people, and for the people, calls for abolition of slavery, mental health and prison reform, as well as women's suffrage, the progressive reform movement of the early 20th century, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, Vietnam protests, and the March for Our Lives all represent the resonance of American ideals of the social contract. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania abolished slavery in 1780, preceded by Vermont in 1777. But the realities of abolition weren't always simple. Vermont's abolition, along with Connecticut and Rhode Island, created laws which made it difficult for free blacks to find work, own property, or even remain in the state. Vermont's abolition was vague and allowed already existing slavery practice to continue. Though slavery was not prominent in the North, African Americans remained discriminated against, unwanted, and subjected to harsh treatment similar to that suffered by enslaved Africans in the South. Laws allowing manumission existed in Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland, which meant that freedom could be purchased or granted in a will. The process was difficult, however. In Virginia, the Assembly had to grant approval for manumission regardless, and by 1806, freed Virginia slaves were required to leave the state within 1 year or face re-enslavement. The 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which opened the Ohio Territory, which includes the present states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, to settlement, banned slavery therein, and in 1808, the international slave trade was abolished. However, smuggling continued until the eve of the Civil War. Southern colonies, desiring more representation in Congress, agreed to a compromise in which 3/5 of the enslaved population would be counted for voting purposes and created a fugitive slave clause. The 3/5 compromise greatly augmented Southern political power. In the Continental Congress, where each state had an equal vote, there were only 5 states in which slavery was a major institution. Thus, the Southern states had about 38% of the seats. Because of the 1787 3/5 compromise, the Southern states had nearly 45% of the seats in the first U.S. Congress, which took office in 1790. Future President James Madison knew that the difference between the states wasn't large and small, but north and south, slave and free, that formed the line of discrimination. Slavery was supported by small planters who owned a handful of slaves and poor whites who owned none. They feared that freed blacks would compete with them for land, and the presence of slavery raised their standing in society, which they willingly accepted. Only a minority of Southern whites owned slaves. Until 1807, single New Jersey women had the right to vote. The revolutionary movement emphasized the importance of education as pivotal to the fate of the Republic, and academies for women's education were opened in New York and Philadelphia. Motherhood assumed almost the importance of a fourth branch of government and considered the mother the custodian of civic morality. Republican motherhood offered women, whose revolutionary participation was so important, a way to combine domestic with political and civil roles, to share their education and instill its value in their children. The Revolution in America inspired the ideals of the French Revolution, as well as the Haitian Slave Rebellion. The language of Latin American independence movements often replicated the Declaration of Independence. The Enlightenment is analogous to the Columbian Exchange in the way that ideas spread, rather than food, people, and diseases. Many new state constitutions place power in the hands of the legislative branch and maintain property qualifications for voting and citizenship. By 1790, approximately 60 to 70% of adult white men could vote. John Adams' Massachusetts Constitution, with a bicameral legislature, an executive with veto power, and a property requirement to vote, became the model state constitution. Adams' inclusion of prohibition against unreasonable search and seizure shows James Otis's influence on his thinking. Shortly after independence was won, a loose collection of independent states were formed, each with their own government. This is known as a confederation. A federal government had to be established, but fear of a return to monarchy led to fear of a strong central power. Americans wanted a republic that ruled with the consent of the governed. The Articles of Confederation were ratified in 1781, written by John Dickinson, Pennsylvania's delegate to the Continental Congress. The Articles of Confederation was America's first constitution, and at the time of their ratification, independence had not been won. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states had more power than the national government, which had the power to carry on foreign relations. The Articles of Confederation had features that made it fundamentally flawed for the purposes of a nation which would be growing. Congress couldn't impose taxes or regulate trade. 9 of the 13 states had to agree to make laws, and all had to agree to amend the Articles. There was no executive branch to enforce the law, and no judicial branch to interpret law. Shays' Rebellion of 1786 was evidence of the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Veterans of the Continental Army or state militias received little pay or reimbursement for their service. European and American creditors felt a need to rein in the enormous debts they were owed and refused further loans while demanding payment in cash. The lack of cash in circulation led to rural farmers' loss of land and property, and hostile sentiments boiled over, especially by those owed payment for military service. When Daniel Shays led 1,500 men to storm the Springfield Armory, he was met by a merchant-funded 1,200-man militia who killed 4 of Shays' insurgents and wounded 20. As there was no national militia to put down rebellions such as Shays', frustrations with the Articles of Confederation grew, and Congress called for delegates to meet in Philadelphia in 1787 for a constitutional convention to fix the problems of the Articles of Confederation. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention faced issues drafting a new constitution and had to answer questions such as how strong the national government would be, how the people would be represented in Congress, how a state's enslaved population would be counted. 25 of 55 delegates were slaveholders, and the framers of the Constitution believed that concessions on slavery were the price of support of the Southern delegates for a strong central government. A Virginia plan of government proposed a government of 3 branches, an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. Members of the bicameral legislature would have been chosen based on population. The small states disliked the Virginia plan and proposed the New Jersey plan. The New Jersey plan suggested a one-house Congress with equal representation for each state. The large states disliked the New Jersey plan. The delegates to the convention eventually agreed on a Connecticut plan to balance state power. A two-house legislature with an upper house, the Senate, which has equal representation from all states, and a lower house, the House of Representatives, whose membership is based on population. The Connecticut Compromise retained the three-branch system of government from the Virginia Plan, which is still in place today. It was evident to most delegates that a central government was needed. Many, though, were fearful of its strength. The question of state versus federal power arose when choosing the head of the executive branch. The outcome was the Electoral College, in which state legislatures choose electors based on a state's representation in Congress to do it. The Electoral College has been controversial since its inception, and there have been 700 amendments proposed to reform or eliminate it over the past 200 years. To ensure the president or Congress would not gain too much power, the delegates created a system of checks and balances. Power would be balanced between three branches, and each can check the power of the other. Separation of powers is an idea which came to prominence during the Enlightenment. Under this system, the legislative branch makes the law, the executive branch enforces the law, and the judicial branch interprets the law. The Three-Fifths Compromise increased Southern political power by counting states, enslaved population, and apportioning representation. Because of the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Southern states had nearly 45% of the seats in the first U.S. Congress and extra representation in the Electoral College, which helped Thomas Jefferson to win the election of 1800. The Constitution also prohibited Congress from outlawing the Atlantic slave trade until 1807, which brought an additional 60,000 slaves into America. The Constitution also gave the federal government power to put down domestic rebellions, including slave insurrections, making all Americans complicit in the institution of slavery. Those who wanted a stronger federal government began to make their case through the Federalist Papers, written mostly by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Federalists believed that separation of powers in the Constitution limited government power and were popular with wealthy and mostly urban. Anti-Federalists feared a strong national government would lead to tyranny, abuse of states' rights, and individual liberties, did not trust government to protect people's rights, and were popular with farmers. Some states, including Rhode Island, North Carolina, Massachusetts, and Virginia, wanted a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution to protect individual liberties before agreeing to ratify it. Only 9 of 13 states were needed for ratification, and it was done before New York and Virginia approved it, but people felt that without the approval of these two large states, the Constitution would never be honored. By 1791, the 10 approved amendments became the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights protects individual liberties, including the right to free speech and of religion, protections against unreasonable search and seizure, against self-incrimination, and many others. Importantly, the Ninth Amendment states that the rights listed don't preclude unlisted rights. The 10th Amendment defines delegated power, those given to the three branches of government, and reserved power, powers that belong to the states or the people. George Washington was unanimously elected president in 1789, with all 69 participating electors casting their ballot for him, and inaugurated in April of 1789 in New York City. Washington was a Federalist that favored a strong central government, but preferred to allow Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist Secretary of the Treasury, to do the political fighting on his behalf. As president, Washington set up the Cabinet, a group of advisors to the president made up of the heads of executive agencies, 4 during Washington's presidency, 16 currently, who, because of their political divisions, created a sort of team of rivals, including Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, the anti-Federalist Secretary of State. Washington oversaw the establishment of the federal court system in 1789, which is still largely intact today. The assumption of state Revolutionary War debts and the creation of the Bank of the United States, as well as the entrance into the U.S. of Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Washington encouraged Americans to be neutral in the emerging conflict between England and Revolutionary France, refusing French envoy Edmond Genet's request to use American shipping ports as locations for French military forts. Genet's visit to America caused further animosity between the Federalists, who believed the French Revolution could destabilize the young America, and the Anti-Federalists, who saw the Revolution as an emulation of our own. Washington moved the national capital from New York to Philadelphia and established the national capital in Washington, D.C. Retiring after his second term set the precedent that would be followed until 1940, and as Washington stepped away, he again warned against American involvement in foreign wars. As Washington declined a third term in 1796, America had its first contested presidential election, a face-off between Federalist John Adams, the sitting vice president, and Anti-Federalist Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. Adams won 71 electoral votes compared to Jefferson's 68, making Adams the president and Jefferson the vice president. This unique situation in which the president and vice president were chosen from competing political parties was rectified by the 12th Amendment, which forced electors to vote for president and vice president separately, implicitly recognizing political parties. In preparation for war with France, an undeclared war which would continue until 1800, known to us as the Quasi-War, John Adams appoints the first commander of the Department of the Navy. Set aside $5,000 for books necessary for the use of Congress, establishing the Library of Congress, which still exists and serves as a research arm of Congress, avoids a declared war with France after the XYZ affair, which we will talk more about later, appoints an historically important figure as Supreme Court Chief Justice in John Marshall, and establishes the peaceful transition of power to a political enemy when Thomas Jefferson is elected president in 1800. A variety of positions on issues such as the relationship between the national and state governments, economic and foreign policy led to the formation of political parties. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Federalists favored stronger federal government and tended to be more urban, wealthy, and involved in industry, while Anti-Federalists favored stronger state governments, tended to be more rural, and saw America's future as a nation of farmers. Alexander Hamilton was tasked with reducing a national debt of $54 million, made up of money owed to foreign nations, private lenders, and soldiers who were paid in land grants and debt certificates after 1781. The federal government raised money through tariffs and excise taxes on the sale of whiskey and tobacco, but was cash poor. Hamilton, who believed that a wealthy ruling class was needed to sustain a stable government, created a controversial three-part plan. The three-part plan included assumption of debt on the part of the federal government, which would create a system in which wealthy creditors would have a permanent stake in the success of the national government. Debt-free states of Maryland, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Virginia didn't initially favor the plan, but came to favor it after a compromise was reached that would locate the nation's capital between Maryland and Virginia. The passage of tariffs to raise revenue and break England's manufacturing hold on the United States, and a national bank and mint to stabilize the banking system. A national bank would collect taxes, hold funds, and make loans to governments and borrowers. Those critical of Hamilton's plan believed it only favored the wealthy because of its aid to the nation's infant industries through tariffs, government subsidies, and government-financed transportation improvements. That it was unfair to soldiers who sold their debt certificates to speculators at a low price during hard economic times, because government assumed debt meant speculators get paid. But the most controversial part was the creation of the National Bank, which Democratic Republicans argued wasn't within the constitutional power given to the government. Alexander Hamilton countered their argument by citing the Constitution's Necessary and Proper Clause, which he believed gave the government power to create the bank. Those, including Thomas Jefferson, who interpreted the Constitution in a way that convinced them the government did not have the power to create the national bank, we identify as strict constructionists. Those, including Alexander Hamilton, who did, we identify as loose or broad constructionists. Washington signed the bank bill, and the Bank of the United States began operations in 1791. Jay's Treaty of 1794 was negotiated over British attacks and impressment of American merchant ships in the West Indies. Because of their neutrality policy, merchants traded with both the British and French, but aided the war efforts of neither. As a result of the treaty, the British promised to leave their forts in the Great Lakes region, but most importantly, it put off direct conflict between the two nations. Pinckney's Treaty of 1795 was negotiated between America and Spain over access to the Mississippi River and the boundary of Florida. The treaty voided guarantees of Spanish support to Native Americans in the disputed areas of Alabama and Mississippi, greatly weakening Native resistance to white encroachment on their lands. The treaty strengthened Federalist support outside of New England and was popular in the South and West. When John Adams sent 3 delegates to France to normalize relations and stop harassment of American shipping by French privateers, they were coolly received, and a $25,000 bribe was demanded of them if they were to speak to the French minister. After the Congress found out the scope of the situation, they activated the Navy and fought a 2-year naval war against France, capturing 2 French ships and signing a treaty in 1800 under which France lifted its embargo on American ships, canceled its letters of marque, and agreed to respect neutral ships and property. The United States agreed to return captured warships, but not pirates. What are known as the Alien and Sedition Acts are actually 4 laws: the Alien Act, the Alien Enemies Act, the Naturalization Act, and the Sedition Act, 3 of which targeted immigrants and acted basically to eliminate French immigration, 1 of which restricted freedom of speech and prosecuted those critical of federal law, making it illegal to publish such criticism. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, written by Thomas Jefferson, were a direct response to the constitutionality of the Alien and Sedition Acts, reserving states' rights to override federal powers not enumerated in the Constitution. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were the precursor to nullification, the idea that if a state was displeased with federal law, that law could be null and void within their state. Hoping to raise money to operate the Confederation government, the Confederation Congress negotiated with American Indians, the states of Virginia and Connecticut, to become sole owner of the lands of the Ohio Territory. The Ordinance of 1784, written by Thomas Jefferson, divided the territory into 10 self-governing districts that could petition the Congress for statehood once they reached 60,000 inhabitants. The Northwest Ordinance abandoned the Ordinance of 1784 and created a single territory out of the lands that eventually became 5 states: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. Although the ordinance prohibited slavery, slaves could be brought into the territory, a fugitive slave clause existed, and Illinois practiced a restrictive form of servitude which denied servants equal protection of the law, the ability to post bail if arrested, the right to stage public protest or assert their rights, the right to bear arms for militia servants. Servants needed a pass to travel and could be sold at public auctions, were denied the right to vote, could not offer testimony against a white citizen in court, deprived of state-funded welfare, and had to carry a pass for continual residence and employment. Because the geography of New England lent itself to a more egalitarian system of family farms rather than forced labor, The New England states began to abolish slavery in the 1790s, beginning with Vermont. The invention of the cotton gin, however, accelerated the growth of Southern slavery, and by the eve of the Civil War, 3.9 of 4.4 million of America's black population were enslaved. Industry took hold in the northern states, and between 1821 and 1870, 7.36 million immigrated to fill jobs there. Americans expressed their pride in the young republic by displaying symbols of patriotism, including replicas of the seal of the United States, the bald eagle, and images of famous Americans in their homes and in public. The American Spelling Book sought to standardize an American form of English that was different from British spellings. Enormously talented painters, including Charles Willson Peale, Gilbert Stuart, and John Trumbull, and architects reflected the democratic values of the new America through their works and designs.